I think we've let in our first group of participants so we can get started just with a little bit of an introduction here. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel and discussion on the intersection of restorative justice and domestic violence, hosted by the COVID-19 Task Force on Domestic Violence. This is the 11th in our seminar series focused on educating and discussing domestic violence during this time. Today, we'll be discussing the topic of restorative justice and domestic violence, as I said. A quick note on this is, of course, restorative justice can be a controversial topic within the field of domestic violence. So this discussion may touch on topics that are triggering to survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence. Just wanted to give that content warning. Thank you, of course, to everyone also who is tuned in. It would be great to get a sense of who's in the audience right now. So if you are willing and able as an audience member and want to just introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, pronouns, and where you're watching the seminar from, that would be great. In the meantime, I will introduce myself, as will Rachel, my co-host. So my name is Chiara Albanese. I take the pronouns she, her, hers. I graduated from Harvard College with a degree in psychology and studies of women and gender and sexuality. And right now I'm calling in from our nation's capital in Washington, DC. Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel Ackerman. My pronouns are she, her. I am currently an undergraduate at the Harvard Extension School studying government relations, and I am based in Princeton, New Jersey.
Awesome. So as I said, Rachel and I are part of the COVID-19 Task Force on Domestic Violence. Our goals are threefold. First, investigation of data on domestic violence. Second, education of the public on the issue and how to get involved. And third, advocacy on behalf of survivors. I, along with everyone else, am so glad you're here with us today. And if you want to learn more about our organization, please do check out the chat for more information. We'll be putting some information in there. In the meantime, Rachel can introduce our panelists.
Of course. So we are absolutely honored to be monitoring this discussion with our incredible panelists who will be providing their expertise, insight, and reflections. With that, let's kick off the introductions. First, we have Dr. Linda G. Mills, who serves as the Executive Director of NYU's Center on Violence and Recovery and the inaugural Lisa Ellen Goldberg Professor at New York University. Her scholarly work develops a new theory and practice of treatment for rethinking our response to violence in intimate relationships. Dr. Mills has been the principal investigator on 2 National Science Foundation studies in Nogales, Arizona and Salt Lake City, Utah, focusing on treatment programs for people convicted of domestic violence crimes using restorative justice principles. She's also the principal investigator on a National Institute of Justice qualitative study related to restorative justice and domestic violence. Dr. Mills's work has been published in Nature Human Behavior, Journal of Experimental Criminology, Cornell Law Review, and Harvard Law Review, to name a few. Dr. Mills is also an accomplished filmmaker. Her films have premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and the Los Angeles Jewish Film Festival, among others, and her film, Of Many, Then and Now, was seen on ABC. Her latest documentary feature film, No Contact, for this year, 2020, builds on 20 years of research on intimate abuse. In addition, Dr. Mills is a Vice Chancellor for Global Programs and University Life at NYU.
Incredible. And
Thank
our
you for
other
having
panelists.
me.
Oh, sorry, Linda, go ahead.
No, just thank you for having me.
We're so excited to. Our other panelist is Dr. Marian Liebmann, who has worked with victims of crime and with offenders. She was director of Mediation UK and now works as a restorative justice practitioner and trainer in the UK. So she's calling in quite late in terms of her time zone here. We appreciate it. She's worked in several African and East European countries. She's involved in helping Bristol to become a restorative city, and she has written and edited 13 books, including Restorative Justice, How It Works. She's presented at the UN Crime Commissions and Congresses, including on restorative justice and domestic violence. And she contributed towards the 2nd edition of the UN Handbook on Restorative Justice Programmes, published in 2020 as well. She's also an art therapist and has applied these skills to work in meditation and restorative justice, running workshops in art therapy, anger, and conflict. So now that we have a bird's eye view of these incredible panelists, we can start asking them some questions about their work.
Can I just correct something?
Yes.
It's not Mediation UK, it's Mediation UK.
Excuse me.
And the workshops I run aren't anything to do with meditation. They're to do with mediation and anger. So you have to get that straight right at the beginning.
That was my reading error. So thank you for correcting that. Mediation and restorative justice. So now that we know that, and know that it's mediation, not meditation, just starting broadly here, could you both define restorative justice for us, or tell us how you would define that as a concept and how it connects to your work?
So who's going first?
You want to go first? You go first.
All right, okay. So there's lots of different definitions of restorative justice, but they all have two important points in common, and that is about trying to put things right rather than punishing people. It's about trying to put things right, and it's also about bringing people who've been harmed together with people who've done the harm in order to make things better, so that communication is part of that, and it is a voluntary process, so you can't make people do it, but the accent is on putting right the harm and communication, and helping the offender, perpetrator, the person responsible to be part of that putting right, obviously if the victim is interested. So I don't know if Linda wants to add something.
Sure. Sure. I mean, the only thing that I'd add is that crime and criminal legal interventions are very different, right? And it's a very different starting point, which is holding people accountable. As opposed to restorative justice approaches to crime, where exactly as you said, Marian, the idea is that if a crime has occurred, somebody has lost something. Something has been taken from them. And so a restorative approach tries to bring that back to that person. Not to make them whole per se, but try and bring them back, bring something back to them. And that happens through that process of dialogue that Marian referred to.
Got it. And just following up.
I want to just add that sometimes people they kind of they think that people have got to be punished, and I think what restorative justice does, it's about taking responsibility rather than taking punishment. You know, if you take punishment, you think it's nothing to do with you, you don't have an active role, but taking responsibility is quite a different thing.
So if we could now talk a little bit about what are the pros and cons of restorative justice within the context of domestic violence.
So I wonder if Linda would like to start.
Sure, I'll start then. You know, from my point of view, I've been doing this research and this work for now over 20 years, and I got into it because the only treatment approach, at least in the United States, that was being used for the most part in domestic violence was batterers treatment, and it continues to be. Over 2,000 programs in the United States use batterers treatment. And that's a program that was founded and started in Duluth, Minnesota, but England obviously had its own version of that kind of programming in order to, again, hold perpetrators accountable. It also attempted to try and bridge the gap and to help a perpetrator find some insight into what may have motivated him or her to cause that violence. For the most part, the pronouns that are used in this case would be him and he. What I'd say about restorative justice is that I came to it because I was so unsatisfied with the treatment approaches that at least in the United States we were using, and all the research seemed to point in the direction that it was not adequate, and that we had focused as a country, particularly in relation to intimate abuse, around accountability, pointing the finger, and holding somebody responsible without having them come forward and say, I am responsible, and doing the necessary work that helps actually heal from crime. And restorative justice kind of gave the most promise in that sense. And that's the reason why I turned to restorative justice. It is controversial insofar as, even though the parties have to come to it willingly and voluntarily, that many advocates of women who have experienced domestic violence believe that sometimes women in violent relationships can't make an independent decision because they're being influenced by their partner. I have not seen that play out in the work that I do in restorative justice and intimate abuse, although I certainly appreciate why advocates might feel that way. So I think that's probably the key, is that for the most part, advocates of victims of domestic violence have taken the position. There have been many exceptions, but for now we'll use this as kind of a broad brushstroke, have taken the position that the victim and perpetrator need separation. They need to be separated. And so treatment should not involve bringing them together, that that's dangerous and inappropriate. And in fact, we also know, though, that many victims reunite with perpetrators after an event has occurred. And so I wanted to take as a starting point this idea that if people were going to be together, then let's help them be together safely.
Yeah, I kind of go along with all of that. I think the dangers that people point out are that the process of restorative justice could just end up with the victim being re-victimized because of the power difference, and that it might look all fine and dandy and everything gets agreed and people, you know, sort of come to some agreement, but that's because if the woman didn't, this again talking mostly men attacking women, there are a few exceptions to that, but that if the woman didn't go along with it, then you know, it would be the worse for her when they get home. So that, you know, people say, well, you know, it would be totally meaningless, and it's kind of wrong to involve victims. But then, as Linda says, if you kind of say, well, we're not going to do that, you can either go to court or nothing. A lot of women choose nothing, and they just go back home and they just continue, you know, with a terrible relationship and continue to be beaten up. So if you've got an alternative, a lot of people are interested in that. You do have to check out whether it's safe, and there was some interesting research in Bristol, which was done by Marian Hester, where they were researching family mediation programs. And when they started, they would invite both partners immediately to come and meet at the office. And then the research showed that actually there was significant incidents of domestic violence. And so really they should be seeing people first on their own. And so I think that's now common practice to check out whether it's safe, and whether the woman feels that she can actually put her point of view without fear and intimidation. And there's been several different programs in the UK. So, some of them are still running, some not. Some started, some counselling to the woman to just check whether she really was happy going forward and didn't feel pressured. And if they completed both of those, then they would bring them together with independent mediators. But there's a lot of practice in Europe, and particularly Austria and Germany. It's quite common practice there, and mostly the Austrian experience has kind of showed that it's been empowering for women, because you have to balance up the safety and the disempowerment of saying to somebody, we've decided it's not safe for you. It's quite disempowering. So as Linda was saying, you know, women, they might need some help to work out if it's the right thing for them. But then in the end, they should be able to make that decision, I believe, and not be sort of patronized and told, oh, you know, this is something that you shouldn't want to do. But then you do have to have some sort of quite good guidelines. You have to make sure about all the safety factors. And as Linda says, there is a bit of a tradition of sort of women's movements wanting to protect victims and saying restorative justice shouldn't be allowed. And in fact, there are, I think it's Spain, I think has a law that says you're not allowed to do it. But most other places, it's really up to the people concerned, particularly the victim. You need to just check the safety angle first and foremost. But I know, I mean, a colleague of mine who spends half his time in England and half his time in North Carolina, and he's a mediator with a domestic violence program there. You know, probably Linda knows all about that one, but they seem to have good results, and particularly good results in prevention of reoffending. So, you know, I think the sort of I think fortunately the general opinion, certainly in the UK and Europe, seems to have swung from this is something that you mustn't do to this is something that should be available for those who want to do it, and especially for victims who want to go forward, and we need to make it safe for them.
Got it. That's really useful context. Thank you, both of you. I guess taking a step back and looking at this specifically in the context of the pandemic, as everything is right now, I'm curious what you both make of the spike of interpersonal and domestic violence given the pandemic, and I'm curious how you feel this new landscape is kind of taking shape.
So I guess I'd say a couple of things. I for the most part don't think about the pandemic without also thinking about Black Lives Matter and all that's happening in the US in rethinking certainly the criminal legal system and all that it means. And so I have found that a number of jurisdictions have reached out to ask the question, how do we do things differently? But let me, before we get to that part of the conversation, just say, painfully, it's not surprising. I mean, you all were motivated to start your organization based on the fact that people are told to stay home, and home is not safe for everyone. I mean, it's tragic that it has taken our country this long. Marian's talked a lot about Europe. Many states, if not most states, still prohibit partners from coming together and doing domestic violence treatment of any sort that's conjoined. And so it is, there are fewer impediments, but it still remains a major issue, a legal issue. So what I'd say is it's tragic that we don't have mechanisms by which we have begun to think creatively and systematically about alternatives to criminalization, because so much of that is impeded by COVID. The only other thing I'd say is just to reiterate what Marian's talked about. We did a study in Utah where we compared the traditional batterers treatment to a combined batterers treatment plus a restorative approach. And the results were astounding, which is we saw a 50% decrease in domestic violence arrests for the batterers intervention plus restorative justice as compared to the batterers treatment only program. And we saw a 50% reduction in the seriousness of the crimes if somebody was arrested. So it, you know, a combination of we need to rethink the ways in which this system addresses criminal justice. We have a ballooning prison and jail population. and we haven't thought creatively, particularly about domestic violence. I understand why, and I understand the history, and I understand why advocates don't want to turn the clock back to the 1950s. That's not what restorative justice is. And so it's important for us, though, to, as thinking and thoughtful, but also research-oriented folks, to really look at the evidence and say what's working and what will work to prevent domestic violence, and particularly during these difficult times.
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of the Austrian research it's done, and the person who did it, whose name is just slipping my mind at the moment. She repeated her research after 10 years. She found that there were kind of good results in the sense that women felt empowered. Mostly they were not about relationships that were going to continue, and a lot of it was about helping the mostly male partners to accept that they had kind of completely messed up, and there was no going back. But when she did the research 10 years later, there seemed to be a bit more of offenders kind of taking a bit more responsibility. So she just hesitated to kind of guess that, you know, could it be possible that there'd been a slight change in the climate and that it was now less acceptable to actually do it, and, you know, men were more ready to listen to those kind of arguments, and that was quite interesting. I just want to mention an interesting project that that I was involved in a kind of consultative capacity. It was it took place in a prison, in Cardiff prison, and the chaplain there was introducing restorative justice, and during her work she discovered that there were many prisoners who were incidentally perpetrators of domestic violence. It wasn't on their records because actually in the UK, domestic violence in itself is not a crime. It comes up as actual bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, wounding with intent, criminal damage, attempted murder, threats to kill, all sorts of other crimes. But what's behind it is domestic violence. And they managed to get, there were 100 people that they identified, and they were queuing up to join this course. And what the course was a week of awareness raising, in which they had talks from victims, they did activities, they kind of tried to see things from the victim's perspective, they did role plays. And on the Thursday of the week, so day 4, they met in small groups. They met victims of domestic violence. Now, not their own victims, because the best thing that they could do for them was to stay away. But there were a lot of victims who wanted to meet offenders, not their offenders, thank you very much, but they wanted to meet others and ask them questions. And this was a safe way of doing it. And so while the men were having their awareness raising course in the prison, the victims were having counselling and being prepared for the meetings separately away from the prison. And then when they met in small groups, like two perpetrators, 2 victims, and a facilitator. And a lot of the kind of comments afterwards were kind of, you know, quite extreme. Some of them, the offenders saying, "I thought about things I'd never thought about before. I became aware in a way I'd never taken these things on board. I want to be a different person." And victims who said, I never thought I would want to do this, but it's the best thing that I ever did. I stopped seeing them as monsters and saw them as human beings. So again, sort of, I think funding is a big issue in the UK. Sort of all sorts of very interesting and wonderful initiatives spring up and then vanish because there's only limited funding, and then it stops. So I don't think that's been replicated elsewhere. And the kind of very inspiring person who got it going is now working in, she's running sort of much wider restorative justice program throughout South Wales. So she's gone on to kind of bigger and better things, if you like, but it means that the prison doesn't have that kind of program anymore. In fact, I think most prisons don't have any programs at all at the moment because of COVID. So people just locked up for 23 hours of the day, which is another whole problem. But somebody sort of said, why the spike of domestic violence? Well, it's a bit obvious, because it's like you have everybody cooped up and not able to go anywhere, and so people can't escape. At the same time, practically all the help agencies that people might have gone to are either non-existent or on a very, very small shoestring. So the kind of the combination of the two means that you might expect that, and financial pressures as well. So it's what people call a perfect storm.
Yeah, and in a small space, right?
Sorry?
Often confined in a small space with children at home.
Yeah.
Yep.
So with all of this in mind, how do you see the future of restorative or transformative justice in the domestic violence space looking? And how would you like it to look?
Should I go, Marian?
Yeah, you go. Yeah.
Okay. So, I have had a dream for 20 years when I came into this to ask the question, how do we do this better? How do we do this differently? And I think the convergence of the sad state of affairs in this country and thinking differently about racial justice provides the convergence for the possibility, finally. It was the argument I made in Harvard Law Review now 20 years ago in 1999, where long ago I believed that we could actually achieve some form of justice for families, particularly families of color, who were oftentimes the targets of police and arrest. And we know that from long-standing studies. Larry Sherman, who of course is both in Pennsylvania and in the United Kingdom, who did some of the earliest studies and asked the right and critical questions that suggested that African-American families were more likely to be arrested for domestic violence, and to develop programs that weren't about separating families, destroying families, and not providing the support that this country has an obligation to provide families, particularly with the long-standing history. And so, I have the dream that a restorative justice approach can provide families with a set of tools that would allow them to not only find the strength and resilience they need, but also to rely on the system to support them through to a better place and time. Now, that might sound idealistic, that might sound ridiculous to people who are experiencing domestic violence at this moment. On the other hand, to Marian's point, it's not about finding a solution for everyone, but it's certainly about finding a solution for those people who are in relationships and want to find themselves to a better place, don't think that a criminal intervention is the right answer. And we sort of leave all those families hanging, sadly. And it's time for us to come up with an alternative approach. And restorative justice, now we've been designing these programs for 20 years, seems to be one of the more promising outcomes. I mean, I'm research focused, so I never think we should do anything without studying it and knowing that it's better, but I think we've done enough research to know that the standard treatment is unsuccessful. And in fact, in this country, we make people pay for that treatment, even though we know that it's not very effective. And so if we're gonna make as a kind of premise the idea that people have to get treatment, let's provide them with the best possible treatment. You can also do restorative approaches without engaging the victim. And Marian's offered a few of those options where you use a different victim. It doesn't have to be that person who experienced that violence. So there are lots of creative ways for leveraging this larger concept of restorative justice. And I think it's about time that we do that.
Yeah, I think it's we kind of know what to do, really. I mean, I think, you know, restorative justice has been proved time and time again. You know, when you put it against other methods, it seems to win in lots of ways. It wins for victims who get to ask questions and tell their stories in a way that they don't do at court. You know, a court is often a very unsatisfactory experience for victims. They don't come away with sort of what they need and want. And you know, and I think the reason that there's been so much research is that for some people it's politically unpalatable. There's no reason to it, but the people who believe in punishment, you know, the kind of people that we unfortunately have in power in both our countries and a few others, they just believe in punishment and in retributive means of dealing with things, and so they don't like restorative justice. It's almost like it kind of pays them to have high crime rates, and so it's a kind of political thing. And so what they do is to say, oh yeah, very promising idea, I think we need some more research. So even the Labour government, that they now seem like angels, but at the time they seem to have some. They obviously, from my point of view, they were better than the other lot, but they seem to have some flaws. And even they said, "Oh well, we believe in this, but just let's have some more research and let it be about serious crimes." And we're just not sure. And then they paid for the research. They sat on the report for about 4 years, and when it finally came out, it said all the things that we know. And you know, you mentioned Larry Sherman. I mean, he and a colleague produced a kind of definitive handbook of all the research programs. So we know that it works, and so what it depends on really is whether we can persuade politicians to provide the resources, and that's what I hope, you know. And I think it starts with actually acknowledging where the problems are. So acknowledging the way that, you know, COVID has given rise to a rise in domestic violence, acknowledging that, you know, Black people have suffered out of all proportion to their numbers and their misdemeanors, and to actually then, you know, try and put something into law and into resources. And so it's a bit like I'm holding my breath to see if those things actually happen. You know, people talk about building back better, and they talk about we're going to do things so differently now. But I just want to see, some changes in the law, and I want to see some resources attached. And both of those would give me a lot more hope than if it's just fine words.
That's incredible and very optimistic, and very cool to hear that this seems like a unique time and a special time for this kind of change to take place. I'm curious, after hearing what you shared, how you would want this to look in more concrete terms. Like, what are best practices for implementing these kinds of programs and this kind of treatment or practice? What's the best way we could go about implementing or doing this? in a sort of day-to-day practice sense.
Shall I?
Yeah, go
go
ahead,
first
Marian.
this
Yeah.
one?
Yeah.
So first of all, to make restorative justice available nationally in the UK, I'm talking about the UK because that's where I live, so it isn't what we call postcode lottery. I don't know if you have the same kind of phrase. It means that, you know, depending on where you live, you might get a service or you might not. So restorative justice was ring-fenced for about 3 years, but now it just depends on each area has a sort of victim, a police and crime commissioner, and depending whether they like restorative justice or not, you get the resources or you don't. So in my area, we're lucky. The police and crime commissioner is a woman, and she loves restorative justice, and she provides allocates the funds so that, you know, we have a service. And the service that I'm a practitioner with, it has 3 branches. It has a community mediation branch, it has a restorative approaches branch, and it has a hate crime branch. And so it is relatively well funded. And I'm not sure, I think we have an occasional domestic violence cases. I think there's a kind of an acknowledgement that no crimes are off limits. It just depends on the circumstances, but you still have to persuade people that they will be suitable to refer. So I think there is a way to go to persuade people to part with information. So you obviously need a lot more awareness raising with referring agencies. You need to have it nationally available, and so we have a kind of victims code which says that something like victims have the right to information about restorative justice. Well, you can see the flaws in that already. Very nice. Okay, here's your information. There's no service in this area. Great. You need the victims code to say victims have a right to a restorative justice service. And then when it's a right and when it has to be done, then resources will follow. So you need it to be available. And then, of course, you need to have a training, awareness raising, publicity, stories, all the things that kind of make up something that is vibrant and actually happening rather than something that is in a backwater. So you have to do, you know, make sure that everybody's aware of it. It's interesting that in Northern Ireland, after the Troubles, it is so often after Troubles that people bring in restorative justice. It's kind of interesting. It happened in Eastern Europe as well. But they had a restorative justice law, and all the cases for young people, they all go the restorative justice route, either via the court or not via the court, depending on how serious it is. And the only offences not to go that route are ones as serious as murder and the ones as trivial as not paying your bus fare. So they do domestic violence cases automatically because it's the law. And so and it becomes a way of life. You know, somebody from Northern Ireland once described to me, they said, well, we're a very small group with 6 counties, and by now practically everybody has either been a victim and gone to a restorative meeting, had a member of their family being an offender and gone to a restorative meeting, been a teacher or a youth worker and been involved in a restorative meeting. So this is the way we do things around here. So you have to somehow get to that sort of stage, but it takes a lot of political will and some resources. Of course, the resources will be recouped because you don't have to go to court so much, and so you might be saving money, but you always have a difficulty certainly in the UK, if you're going to be saving money in one department and spending it in another, each department wants to hang on to its money. So it's kind of big efforts that you need in lots of practical ways.
So what should I talk about the American context, the United States context, which is complicated in some of the same ways, Marian, that you've referred to. The bottom line is that the criminal laws obviously are local. So it's state defined. Sometimes it's even county defined, to Marian's point, where you'll find somebody who's interested in restorative justice. That's how come we had a study in Nogales, Arizona, and we had a study in Salt Lake City, Utah. I had 2 judges who became interested in thinking about the fact that the treatment they were offering offenders wasn't effective. And they knew that, and they wanted to do better, and they wanted to do differently. So oftentimes it is inspired at the local level. To Marian's very inspirational comment, the question is, if you get enough people engaged in a restorative approach, you start to get that kind of elevating effect where people realize how valuable an approach it can be as an alternative. And that's very hard to secure in a country as diverse as ours, particularly during this moment when it feels very, very divided, and COVID has only reinforced those divisions. So all that is to say, our approach more recently has been to find jurisdictions who are willing to adopt it, to develop those programs with the jurisdiction. What are your priorities? How does our approach to restorative justice help underpin your priorities as both holding people accountable, but also for transformative change, which is usually what people are looking for? How do we help somebody realize that what they did was seriously problematic, and how to make amends for that, and then not do that behavior again? And that's really the trick. We have a curriculum, we have a method for doing that, but really it's about exactly what Marian said. It's about political will. And in this country, really difficult to sell. On the other hand, post-COVID, we have gotten more calls about our restorative justice program, and that is both a combination of the convergence of the moment and an increase in domestic violence crimes, but also sort of thinking differently about how we administer crime and address crime in this country, and label crime, and who gets labeled.
These are all very timely and just powerful ways of thinking. So I'm wondering, what would your recipe for success be for a successful restorative justice treatment program, intervention? Just what does your ideal program look like?
So why don't I'll pick this up, Marian. In a way, it just carries on from what I was talking about, and then it'd be great to hear, based on the really vast work that you've done. I mean, for me, success is about the outcome. And I always measure the outcome. It wasn't enough to go into this and say, rah, rah, restorative justice is our answer. We needed to know whether it was an answer. So I think I started in Nogales with a pure restorative approach, or was a pure restorative justice approach as compared to a pure batterers treatment approach. And we didn't find the results we found in Utah, where we combined the domestic violence, and this, Marian, speaks to the program you described, where we combined some of the principles, best principles of the Duluth model. So people started to understand the ways in which their violence manifested. And that happened first. And then you brought them together, assuming you had willing parties, you brought them together to do a more restorative approach. And let me just say, restoration isn't just about people wanting to stay together. It's also about separating peacefully. What we know about domestic violence is some of the most dangerous time is when people make the choice to separate. And so creating an environment like a restorative approach that allows somebody to separate peacefully is absolutely crucial. So we shouldn't be thinking about restorative justice about, oh, it's going to bring parties back together. It's not. We don't need to go into it with any of those assumptions. but only that people willingly want to look at what happened, examine what happened, think about what happened, talk about what happened, and change their behavior as a result. So I think my ideal program has come to be the program that we talked about in Nature Human Behavior, which is a combination of the Duluth model programming together with restorative justice, some number of weeks of Duluth programming, and then to prepare people, again, as Marian has mentioned, to prepare people to be able to come together and ask some hard questions about what happened and how we prevent that from happening again in the future.
Yeah, I would go along with all of that. I mean, I think there are lots of different ideal programs. I think there are many ways of doing this. You know, I've described the prison program. I've described what one mediation service did. I know there are other methods. I know some people have done circle sentencing in sort of classic mediation. Sort of both people go and talk to the one party and then the other party, and then bring them together. In Austria, they do what they call mixed doubles, where the man interviews the man, the woman interviews the woman, and when they come together, the mediators present what the parties have said, so that they get a bit of distance. And then there's the conferencing model that came from Wagga Wagga in Australia and is now sort of much beloved by UK police. Only I have to say, often they do it in a rather mechanical way, which isn't what you need. So I think there are lots of different ways of doing things, and they can all be successful. They all need to be researched, as Linda says. You know, we don't want to be going forward with things that don't work. But I think there are, depending on your circumstances and the culture, you know, there are different ways of going about things. I think I want to mention one other thing, which is, I think, is sometimes a side effect of success, that people get to the stage where this is what we do around here. We know what we're doing. We know it works, and they start to get a bit slapdash, and they do things in a routine kind of a way. They don't allow enough time. They don't train people properly, and they think they can just get away with you know, ticking the boxes. And yeah, I heard from somebody who did some research in Northern Ireland, and they thought that, you know, one of the sad things there was that there were some places that were beginning to go down that route. And just to talk about something else that's related, not exactly the same, was about hate crime. There was a really wonderful book written by Dr. Mark Walters about research in hate crime, and he compared two programs. One was a community mediation service that you wouldn't think would be dealing in hate crime necessarily, but they had cases, and he compared that with a police-run restorative justice service. And what happened was that the community mediation service had much better results because they took lots of time and they made sure that people were going forward willingly, and they helped people to see each other's points of view, and they managed to get some quite good results. Whereas the police-based one was very short of resources. The police were given half a day's training, and they just would say to the offenders, in hate crime cases, no, you better apologise. And so they would then retail these apologies to the victims, sometimes on scraps of paper, just a scrap of paper saying sorry, and they would hand that to the victim, and the victim would say, well, that's worse than anything, because it's not sincere. it's not meant. It's just somebody ticking the boxes in order to get off and not accept responsibility. So I think the kind of you have to make sure that you have the resources, not just to kind of do a bare minimum and sort of cover the cases. You need to make sure you have resources to do things properly, and sometimes, you know, when things get established, people don't bother to do that. They bring in targets and say you've got to do so many cases, and you're short of time, and okay, and we're going to sort of take a member of staff away, and you know, because you know funds are short, etc. But you've still got the same targets. So that is something to guard against. That, you know, you have to make sure that the quality remains, the quality of the human relationships. You know, restorative justice is not a tick box exercise. So,
Excellent. That's all really interesting and seems obviously incredibly important to consider when thinking about implementing these programs. I'm realizing we're coming up on our hour mark here, which is astonishing to me. This has passed very quickly. Thank you for all of your thoughts. But I'd love to close out. Of course, part of the intention behind the seminar series is to give our audience and the folks who are listening in or who will later watch this recorded video the opportunity to know how they can get involved with combating and helping to resolve domestic violence incidents. I'm curious if either of you have ideas, suggestions, recommendations on how bystanders or just your average citizen can get involved in helping with this issue.
I have an idea.
yeah.
Marian, you probably have some ideas too. I mean, I'm assuming that most of the people are in the United States. I saw people had said, you know, California, there were others, Boston and New York. All of those important city centers offer restorative justice training. And if nothing else, just engaging yourself in a training so you learn the basic principles of it will help you both understand the value of it, but also you can see why, I think for me and probably for Marian, but I certainly wouldn't speak for Marian, why once I was trained in the values and the technique, it became obvious to me that this was a lifelong skill and a way of approaching life. And so, you know, that's where I'd start, assuming you're interested in thinking differently about domestic violence and how restorative justice might be useful. I would suggest so many not-for-profits now offer these trainings. You can also be a volunteer. So in our restorative justice approach to domestic violence, both in Nogales and in Utah, there is the requirement that there is a community member who participates in the restorative justice process. Part of this was to ensure that we don't re-privatize violence and that a community member bears witness to what is happening in the circle and the transformational change. This is not somebody who knows the people in the family. This is not a family member who's participating. This is somebody who's coming in as a community member to bear witness to the process. So the other role you can play once you've been trained is to understand how you might contribute as a participating community member. So those would be my two contributions just to this restorative justice. There are many things to do for victims of domestic violence, but because our focus is on restorative justice, I think that's particularly helpful.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, you can, many youth offending teams run restorative justice training and will have a group of volunteers, or many cities have them available, so you can do that. And the other thing is that, of course, you can do lobbying in favour of restorative justice, lobbying in favour of providing restorative justice for domestic violence cases, and there's, you know, heaps and heaps of work there. So it's kind of on the kind of practical front and on the policy front. I think those are the two sort of places that you can put some effort in.
Excellent. And we'll aim to follow up with everyone who provided their email with some resources and links for you all, so you can work to get involved. Thank you. Those are really good suggestions and ideas. So I will let everyone go and go to their evening. I know, Marian, it's probably about bedtime for you. But looking beyond this episode, our task force is doing a lot of work aside from just this seminar series, and there will continue to be more and more seminar series. So I think Rachel's about to post our information so you can stay up to date with the task force. So feel free to follow those links there. And otherwise, just thank you so much, of course, Marian and Linda. This was really, really fascinating. And we can't thank you enough for taking the time and putting in the energy to chat with us tonight.
And one other thing, I know that Marian's written several books. All I want to say is that the research we just did in Utah just came out about a year ago, and it might be useful to be able to post those links. So I'll get those to you, okay?
Excellent. Yeah, book links coming as well.
Great.
I just want to wish everybody good luck at these sort of difficult times, because I know, we face so many parallel issues in the US and the UK. It's and we've got Brexit to deal with as well, which is another whole story. But anyway, I think that sort of, just want to keep you in mind and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Marian, and same to you, and same to everybody. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you all so much.
Okay. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye.